All right, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. My name is Shruti Tekwani, and I am a licensed mental health counselor as well as a coach, and I focus predominantly on grief, trauma, and loss. I spent about 13 years in the Boston area working with college students in
Yay!
their at a time where I figured they needed me most. I did a lot of the disciplinary stuff. I was an RA and then I was an RD, and I was the person that they saw when they were in trouble, but also when they needed somebody to be there for them. So I'd like to think that I was there for them at a place where they were away from home, but they felt like they could depend on somebody that was a sense of comfort for them. And that's pretty much what I like to dedicate my life to doing is being there for people on their worst day is what I say. A few of my friends ask me, so basically you hope for tragedy and you hope for trauma and you hope for that because that's your job. And I say to them, it's not necessarily that I hope for this bad stuff to happen, but when it does, when it happens in your life, you kind of hope that someone's trained to deal with it. You know, like you never hope for a house fire, but when there is a house fire, you're very grateful for the firefighters. And that's how I like to look at it. A little bit about my educational background. I graduated with a master's degree in counseling psychology a few years ago, about 8 years ago. And as I delved deeper into my favorite modality, which is called choice theory, I was able to process my life a little bit more with my sister and being a sib and all the impact that it's had on me that I was oblivious to all of it growing up. I am 36 years old. My sib is 32 years old. For me, she was just my younger sister who just needed more protection than anyone else, and that was it. Um, she was born with cerebral palsy, so she has had a disability all of her life, but yet it was difficult for me to comprehend the impact that it was having on my life. Still, every day, I find that I'm discovering new emotions, I'm discovering new intricacies. I continue to explore them. And as I do this, I like to share as much as possible of what I'm learning and perhaps make the journey a little bit easier for other SIDS. And maybe it'll be a little less painful and less lonely. And that is pretty much why I'm doing this webinar, because I am a grief therapist, like I mentioned, and I think it's so important to be there for other SIBs because as far as I know, there are not a lot of resources for SIBs like us. A little bit, I just wanted to tell you just a tad about my SIB. That's her right there on the screen. That pretty much sums up our relationship. I am very protective of her and she is my little baby. Her name is Mega, and like I mentioned, she was born about 4 years after me, and she was born in India at a time where the resources were limited for people with disabilities. So we moved to the Caribbean, where we have lived since then. And then, of course, I left for college and grad school, and I had my life in Boston. And she remains to live in Curacao, which is in the Caribbean. So, as a grief counselor, I've learned that grief doesn't necessarily mean death. It really, I define it as any sort of loss that you've experienced in or out of your control. And I say in and out of or out of your control because sometimes we choose to let go or walk away from something that's not serving us anymore. And it's our decision to do, but that doesn't mean we don't grieve it. And anytime what is happening in our life does not match up with this picture that we've developed in our heads of what life should be, we tend to grieve it. There's a loss and we get sad about it. And sometimes it's easier to kind of handle and say, okay, things are not matching up with what I thought would happen. And sometimes it's not as easy to accept or adjust, and we mourn the loss a little bit more. And sometimes you don't even comprehend it. And some examples of this excuse me, are some examples of the non-death related grief that I'm talking about are breakups, ending of relationships, a diagnosis, perhaps it's an illness or an amputation of a limb, something that happens that causes you to lose hearing or sight, retirement, a robbery, any sort of loss that you experience is what I consider grief. And I wanted to bring that out because I'll get into death related grief, of course, but just so you know, that's how I relate grief. That's how I describe grief. And to me, the grieving process just means that we're trying to make sense of the loss and how to continue on with life without that person, that idea, that concept, that thing that we're either used to having or the thing that we're realizing we're not going to be having anymore. And in a way, it can almost be categorized as an ambiguous loss, which is defined by a loss that doesn't have any closure or any clear understanding. The person experiencing the loss is left to search for answers. They're sometimes left to make up their own answers to what happened. And that can really complicate and delay the process of grieving when you don't have that closure or the why to what happened. Excuse me. I would also say that in the case of SIBs, sometimes we don't necessarily know we're grieving something. So I, for example, growing up, did not realize I was grieving the loss of a sibling relationship all my life. I'm fortunate my sibling's alive, but it took me a while to comprehend that some of the things I was feeling was grief. And it wasn't until my late 20s that I realized my reactions to events were different, and the people around me were curious and noticed that my reactions were not what they were expecting, and they didn't seem to understand what I was feeling. And it wasn't until much later, after I kind of did some soul searching, that I realized that what I was feeling was grief. And it took a while to then process the fact that it was okay to feel grief even though nobody had died. And really, I was mourning the loss of this relationship that I never had. And so, with all that being said, when it comes to death related grief of a SIB, there can be so many more layers of complication because a lot of us have already grieved in a very different way. And then we are dealing with the death related grief. So many of us have always been grieving the loss of relationship and have been put into different roles that we've expected. Some of us took on a parent or guardianship role. Some of us have walked away from family situations that have become unbearable and gotten in the way of our own self-care. Some live with our siblings and haven't seen our siblings in years. Really, it comes with this array of emotions and situations. And the interesting about this is that typically this sibling relationship is supposed to be the longest relationship we ever have in our lives. And if you think about it, that makes sense. And I'm talking a typical lifespan, because we expect, as human beings, we expect to lose our parents during our lifetime. That's just kind of the normal order of life. And of course, there are exceptions. But our friends may come and go. Our spouses, our partners, they enter our lives much later on after our siblings are already in our lives. So considering that we're expecting this to be the longest relationship, when it ends, this throws us for a loop, and we're not quite sure what to do with this. And this is a normal sibling relationship. So when you add a sibling with a disability, it becomes even more confusing. So when we're forced with the death of a sibling, the word grief just doesn't seem to justify the volcano of emotions that bubble up. And I call it a volcano because for me, it feels like this bubble that has nowhere to go, and it kind of erupts sometimes, and sometimes it's dormant, sometimes it's active. I've heard the phrase grief comes in waves, and some of you guys might have heard that as well. And sometimes I think it's also a volcano, so it can be both for sure. Sometimes there's guilt involved in grieving our siblings because they're no longer living and we are, and that can kind of work on us. Like, I need to be living for them, or I get to do this, they didn't, or they never got to fulfill this dream that, what people normally have dreams about: having families, I want to have a pet, I want to have a job, just that picture that you have in your head of what life should look like. Sometimes there is guilt attached to that because they can't do that and we can. And then sometimes there's the guilt of, I wasn't there enough, I wasn't present enough, I didn't take care of them enough, and that plays on our heads as well. Sometimes there's actually relief when we lose a sibling with a disability because they were in pain or they were suffering. And there are times where there is relief because we were the caretaker, and this frees us up. And yeah, it's a horrible thing to say and people feel guilty thinking it, but it is indeed true that, okay, now, what do I do with all this time? I was a caregiver and they're not here anymore. What do I do with this time? So there's that guilt and there's the relief, and sometimes they can come together as well, which complicates things even more. At times there's also been, I've known siblings to feel jealous, especially when they're still alive. And that can lead to some intense emotions after they're gone as well. Jealousy that all the parents' attention was on them, or jealousy because they needed something and you were always kind of pushed aside growing up. If anyone's ever watched the movie Wonder, that kind of touches on that a little bit, where it's this little boy with a facial deformity, and the older sister is very protective of him and very understanding and sweet. Excuse me. But there does come a point in the movie where she feels invisible because it's always his needs that come before hers. And after the sibling, I mean, in the movie, everything turned out fine, but in real life, I imagine that after the sibling, if he passed away before her, she might feel some guilt. Like, why didn't I appreciate him while he was here? How could I have thought that? I'm so selfish. And I don't know about anyone else, but I know I have struggled a lot with the guilt of feeling selfish at times when I put my needs in front of my siblings. So we'll talk about that in a bit as well. So as I mentioned earlier, my favorite modality of psychology is called choice theory psychology, and it's by Dr. William Glasser. And the interesting part about Dr. Glasser's career is that although he was a psychiatrist, he actually never prescribed medication during his career. And a lot of people will know that the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist is a psychiatrist prescribes medication, a psychologist is more about the talk therapy. And he was a psychiatrist, but he never prescribed medicine. And so that was really intriguing to me when I was studying him. And he understood and explained human behavior in such a way that's just so easy for anybody to understand, just not necessarily only people in the behavior field. And choice theory has many layers to it, but one of the layers I want to talk about for sure, and that I think about the most when I think about sib-related grief, are what he described as the basic needs of every human being. And a lot of you may have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the needs that I'm going to be talking about are not Maslow's, they're actually choice theory ones, but I just wanted to show you a look at both of them. And I have a couple of visuals. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Anyone have any issues?
Oh, yes. That's
okay,
good.
Awesome. Great. Thank you for that. And I apologize for the coughing, getting over the flu, and the cough is always the last to go for me.
All right.
So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and anyone that's looked into this is familiar with this triangle. And I actually really liked it when I saw it. And I'll explain the choice theory needs and how they're a little different. The thing with Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that it kind of tells you where to start and where you want to end up. Start at the bottom, end up at the top. And the visual shows that the psychological needs are greater than the ones above it. And I'm just not sure that it is that simple for every human being. So the needs that I like to talk about are Dr. Glasser's needs, which, oh, that did not work out well for me. Wow. Okay, so I'm going to describe them, and then I will, when I send this out, I will make sure that I correct the PowerPoint and send it out to you guys. So what Dr. Glasser described as our basic needs are 5 needs. The first one is survival, and that's the need to be safe, be secure. That's a physical need to make sure that you have food, that you have beverages, that you have shelter, you have physical comfort. You have what you need to be safe. So whether that's a physical roof over your head, whether it's a paycheck to make sure you can get those things, your job, all that stuff is survival. Your love and belonging, which also can be a connection need because it's not necessarily a romantic love, is the need to form and experience positive relationships. And it's anywhere really. It's like I said, it's not just romantic love. Oh, they're showing up. Okay, good. It's not just romantic love, but it's rather any sort of connection, any human connection that you find with anything. It could be with your pet, it could be with your best friend, it could be with your coworker. That connection is so important, and it can really make a difference when we don't have that need met. Power is a third need, and I want to be very careful and say this is not to be confused with control, but power is more of an achievement need. This is where you get to experience that you have a voice in the world, that you are listened to, that you're valued, and that you matter. The fourth one is freedom, and this is the need to experience autonomy, where you get to make choices, you seek novelty, you get to decide what you wear in the morning, you get to decide what you eat, how you spend your time. And the fifth need, excuse me, is fun. And that is the need to experience joy. That's the need to laugh, to really enjoy life. And learning also falls into that fun category. And the reason I like this modality so much is because it doesn't necessarily tell you which need is greater or which need you need first, because Dr. Glasser said that survival is the physical need. Without survival, if you're not living, the other 4 don't matter. The other 4 are psychological. And survival is kind of the baseline, like I said, if you're not breathing, you're not living, you're not eating, the other 4 really don't matter. However, he also said that every human being has all 5 needs, but we all need them in different capacities. So, for example, I'm a big love and belonging person. I need love and belonging more than all the other needs. I'm not a very high survival person. I go to work. I don't necessarily work for one company. I am an independent contractor. And the last thing on my mind is billing people. That's just not something that I think about. I just don't, it's not high on my priority. I'm a love and belonging person. I don't like to ask people for money. And that's something to pay attention to, because eventually I'm going to need to survive, and I'm going to have to put aside that love and belonging in order to feed the survival, to live. The power need is something like I mentioned when I used to live in Boston. I worked at a college campus where I made decisions every day about people's lives, whether they stayed at school or not, whether they stayed in their jobs or not. Every day it was just decision after decision at staff meetings, at any meetings really. My voice was heard, my opinion was taken into account. That was feeding my power need, and I didn't even know it. Freedom, um, you know, if you ever find yourself kind of irritated because you find that, well, this person is telling me to do something and that just makes me not want to do it at all. um, a lot of people, I think, it resonates with them. Like, as soon as you're told not to do something, you want to do it even more. Maybe you're a high freedom person. And then the fun need, just the need to experience joy and the need to either learn a lot or to make sure there's fun in absolutely everything you do. And we can sometimes recognize these people because we'll be at an event or at a webinar or anything really, and they're the ones kind of talking inside, or they're the ones like the class clowns, you would say. They're the high fun need people. And excuse me, I bring this up and I think it is so important in dealing with grief because we choose these needs. We act every time we behave, every time we make decisions to do anything in our lives, whether it's something as simple as drinking a glass of water or getting really angry and throwing something across the room or being frustrated and crying. Every time we do that, we're getting one of these needs met. And that also can relate to emotions. Whenever we behave, whenever we're doing something, a lot of times they're related to one of these needs not being met. If you can think back to the last time or a time in your life where you have reacted to something in a very different way that didn't seem like you, and maybe people commented on it, or maybe you realized, hey, that's really unlike me, something's off. Perhaps it's because your needs were in a different place that week or that day. And I believe from my experience, when your needs are not being met, they kind of creep up on you and ask you to pay attention to them. And then we behave in a way that gets them met. So if you're normally happy go lucky and nothing really bothers you, and you're really not a high power person, but that week your power need has been in the negatives because you haven't been feeding that need, maybe someone steals your parking lot at the grocery store and you just kind of lose it on them. And that's just not you, but perhaps that's what that was your power need needed a little bit of attention and a little bit of filling. So sometimes we actually choose one need over the other. I explained that I'm a high love and belonging person and I'm not a high survival person. And a good example of this is I'm allergic to dogs and cats. And my best friend here on the island has a dog. And she invited me to spend Christmas with her a couple years ago. And she warned me that it was a 3-hour process to open presents because she has a huge family. And I went over and I took my Benadryl and I took my inhaler and I thought, I'm going to be fine. And I sat there, and after 1 hour, I was sneezing and my eyes were watering and I was itching and I wasn't comfortable. But my love and belonging need was really winning over my survival need. And I just kept going. I kept sitting there, and the dog was cuddling with everyone. In hour number 2, my throat was itching. My eyes were really red. I looked terrible. I looked like I really needed some medical attention. And finally, after 2.5 hours, I even thought to myself, okay, I need to choose survival over love and belonging because this is not working out. And so I finally left before presents were open. But we do choose certain needs over the others, and it's important to know and to pay attention to, because sometimes when we're not feeling good inside of ourselves, when we're feeling emotions that are new to us or that are uncomfortable, it's usually because these needs are not being met. So when it comes to our SIBs, our needs can get really complicated and intertwined with theirs, only because oftentimes we are most concerned about their survival need. If we're the ones thinking for them, if we are their voice, if we are the ones who are kind of in charge of them, of making sure they're okay, especially if you're in a caregiver role, you are concerned with their survival. All the other needs, it's secondary to us, right? It's secondary as long as they are physically okay. But if this were to be a regular sibling relationship and your sibling did not have a disability, yes, you're going to care about their survival, but more likely that's going to be fitting your love and belonging need and or your fun need or even freedom, whatever it is. But that's a big difference, at least in my case, where I am most concerned about her survival need. Yes, I want her to feel connections with people. I want her to feel like she has a say, that things are not happening to her, that she has a say in what she does and wears and eats and all that. And I want her to feel that sense of freedom as well, where she is being heard, and the fun. Of course, I want her to have fun. But first and foremost, survival. And then the rest of them come into play. So that's a huge change in what we would normally pay attention to. Excuse me. So a lot of you might have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was a well-known psychiatrist that did a lot of research on grief. And she actually came up with the 5 stages of grief, which I believe I have. Oh, no, I want to skip ahead. She came up with the 5 stages of grief. And she said that people go through these stages and you can kind of move around, but they are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And while I definitely respect these stages, I know personally for myself, anytime I have gone through grief, I seem to skip the anger part. And so it doesn't necessarily resonate with me because I've gone through the denial, I've definitely gone through the bargaining, gone through the depression, and sometimes I mean, yes, I come to the acceptance, but sometimes when it's death related, yes, I've come to the acceptance. When it's non-death related, there are times that I haven't. So this model is great and it works, but if I really look at it, it addresses different needs, and the needs that I'm talking about here on our screen is what I would pay attention to a little bit more, because every person is different. And there's actually a needs assessment that you can do if you're interested. And if you guys are interested in me sending that to you, I'm happy to do that if you put your emails in the chat. If you go to the bottom of the webinar on your screen, there's a little chat room that you can open and you can put your email address and I can send you a needs assessment where you get to pick, where you fill out this multiple choice quiz and you'll know a little bit more about yourself and what your high needs are. And I believe once you know what these needs are, you understand yourself a little bit better and it's easier to navigate those feelings, whether it be grief or sadness or guilt or depression, whatever that is, because you get to think about, okay, I was really depending on this person for my love and belonging need, or this person really totally filled my power need bucket because I made all the decisions for them. They listened to me. I was their rock. I was everything to them. And now that they're gone, my power need is empty. What do I do? And so you can kind of think about how to fill those needs in other ways. For example, if I know for a fact that I want children and that there's no 2 ways about it, I must have children. I'm a high love and belonging person. Um, that's how I'm going to get filled. And then I find out that I cannot have children for whatever reason. I can't change that because that's not in my control, but I can look at what needs would have been fulfilled had I had children, and then think about other ways that perhaps those needs could be fulfilled so that that hole, that gap is not as burning. So it doesn't promise to take away the pain, but it can help you figure out what exactly is it that your heart is hurting for, and try to fill it in with other things that are a little bit more productive and that are healthier for you. Um, Something else that's interesting to think about is the timeline of grief. And really, there isn't any timeline of grief, any sort of grief, because everyone is different. And somebody, a grief counselor, actually, I overheard saying to somebody once, well, it takes about half the time that you were in a relationship with a person if it's a breakup. And
Mm.
I remember chuckling because I remember thinking, I didn't know there was a formula. Um, and I also, in the same grief counselor, I heard her telling somebody else, well, if your husband dies, it takes 2 years. That's what it takes. And I mean, I'm not married. I have never experienced the loss of a husband. I I'm not being judgmental, but I don't believe it's a formula or it's an answer. I think it really depends on your needs and how you're getting them met, and um, where you want to go from there in terms of getting what you need, right? And fitting those pieces together. Something that's also helpful to think about when thinking about grieving your sib is what type of grief have you experienced? Because this is a very different type of grief. This is not going to be any like you've ever had in the past. So it is important to kind of acknowledge, okay, this is what I've been through. This is not going to be like last time. For some people, this is the first loss they've experienced, and that is just, it's huge. And to give yourself permission to feel what you're feeling, because feelings are never wrong. So whatever it is you're feeling, if you're feeling the relief that, okay, I have my evenings to myself now because I don't need to take care of my sibling because they're gone, give yourself permission to feel that. It's okay to feel that. You know, I can't say it enough. Feelings are never wrong. If you want to think about those feelings and think about what they mean to you and try to explore them a little bit more, that's a different story. And there are people that are here to help you with that. But allow yourself to feel whatever it is that you're feeling, and find a safe person or space or location where you can feel those feelings. You know, sometimes it's a matter of going to a special spot physically where you can just grieve, and that's kind of like your place to go and cry or scream or do something that you used to do with your siblings. If you guys used to eat ice cream together, you go there and eat ice cream, you know, on like kind of to celebrate that connection. I also recommend sometimes kind of putting things together like in a shoebox or in a storage box or something like that, where that's kind of like your memorial for your sibling. Like these are their favorite things, or those are the special memories. Maybe you did something together, maybe you took a trip together, maybe they had a nickname for you and you kind of, you know, write it down and it's in that box, where that's your special place where you can get to go to remember them. Now, the next thing I'm about to say is a little bit confrontational because it's a different way of thinking about it. And that is that sometimes grief serves a purpose. And I don't mean that it's there to teach you something or tell you something, even though that is the case a lot of times. But what I mean by that is that sometimes we stay in that mode of grief because we're getting something else out of it. I know from personal experience, not with sibling grief, but with other grief, I've held on to the grief longer than I needed to because I was afraid of forgetting the person. And I felt that the only way to remember them and to keep them alive was to be sad about them leaving. And it took me 4 years to realize this when I was doing it. But once I realized that I was hanging on to the sadness of the grief just to make sure they were kept alive in my memory, I realized there are better ways to do this. First of all, I was never going to forget them. Secondly, was there a more productive or a healthier way of remembering them? And was there a way that I could remember them that would even serve others? Um, you know, mothers who lose their kids in drunk driving crashes. Some of you guys may have heard of MADD, that organization, Matt, that helps create awareness for mothers who've lost kids to drunk driving, and they help. I think they go into schools and they talk about drunk driving and how to prevent it and things like that. And that's an example of turning that pain and that grief into something more productive, where you're still remembering the person, you're definitely not forgetting about them, but giving yourself permission and allowing yourself to remember them in a positive, more productive way, rather than that soul crushing sad grief that you're feeling. So that's just something to consider, because I do think that feelings and emotions really, sometimes they're there because they're serving us. We're getting something out of it. And if we look a little bit deeper, it can tell us, once we shed some light on what it is that we're getting out of it. And you have that moment of, aha, it's because I don't want to forget them, or it's because I want to show that I cared so much that I cannot get over this loss. And I'm not saying we wake up in the morning saying, I'm going to grieve my sibling to show the world I cared. Sometimes it's subconscious, but that that could be a possibility. And there are healthier ways of doing it that might be more productive. But of course, this comes later on, not if the loss is fresh. Excuse me. It's also really important to know yourself, because what works for you may not work for me. And that is something that I think is true of any emotional issue. Um, if you have a bad day at work, there are several people on this call. One person's way of coping might be to go running. Another person may want to go swimming. Another person may want a glass of wine. Someone else may want to talk it out with their friend. Another person may want to be left alone altogether. So we're all such different people. Our coping is also very different. And to know ourselves is so important. Again, sometimes it goes back to those basic needs, but it's important to know what works for us and what doesn't work for us. If I'm in a place where I am just so overwhelmed by all this emotion and I don't want to talk to anyone, and someone thinks they're helping me by saying, hey, I'm going to pick you up and we're going to go for a drive and we're going to talk, that's not going to help me. It's important to know myself, to be able to say, listen, that's not going to help me right now, and to speak up for ourselves. And then the other, probably the last part that I wanted to talk about was, pay attention to what you're doing, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, your physiology. Again, this is a little bit more of choice theory, but Dr. Glasser said that all four of those components are related. And when you're doing and thinking something, if you're thinking to yourself, I'm a terrible sibling because I got over this so quickly and I really should be mourning the loss a little bit longer, and everyone's judging me and everyone's going to think I'm terrible, I promise you, you're not going to feel good, because your thinking and your doing, your physical doing, are directly related to your feelings. So watch the self-talk, watch what's going through your head, and watch what you're telling yourself. And also watch the stories that you make up about your sibling, about your life, about what you're doing. Because we as human beings, we are constantly making up stories about what's happening around us. If you're at the mall and you hold the door open to a store for somebody and they just walk by and they don't say thank you or anything like that, we often make up a story in our heads about what happened. Sometimes, well, I know I do. Sometimes it's, wow, they're so ungrateful, or, wow, they're so self-righteous, or, they think that I'm just there to open their door. But if you try to switch that thinking to, oh, they're in such a hurry, or they didn't even see me there, or they're in their own worlds, or maybe they're having such a bad day and they really needed this. That can really change how we feel about the situation. And it happens, I know for me, it happens all the time. It happens when I'm driving, when there's traffic, if somebody cuts me off. Instead of thinking, what a jerk. They think they're more important than me and they need to get there quicker than me. I try to switch it to, they're having an emergency, they need to get there really quickly. And that can really make a difference in how you feel. So watch the self-talk, watch what you're doing, watch what you're thinking. Pay attention to that body physiology, because that can tell you a lot as well. And the last thing, I promise this time, it's the last thing, is to think about what you can control in the situation. Because when there's loss, when there's grief, especially with your sib, a lot of times you can't control the loss. So it is important to think about, in the situation, I still have choices. So what are those choices and what can I control? And to differentiate what is within your control and what isn't. So that is all I have. If anybody has any questions, or actually, you know what, that I lied. I have some resources that I wanted to share, which of course I'll share with you when I post the link to this webinar as well. But were there any questions or any comments, anything at all?
Well, I actually took a course on grief, and this was in regards to I actually have two siblings with developmental disabilities. But it was more in line with a chronic medical condition that I have, and the loss of my ability to do things because of it. And I'll tell you, it was one of the most profound changes for me in so many ways, because we have, my sister and my brothers and I have lost both of our parents now. As far as, the death grief thing, our mom recent is about 18 months ago.
Wow.
And the intensity of the grief that John, our brother that has autism, goes through, he's so high functioning, has such a understanding of it. I never took into consideration what you mentioned earlier when I took this class and discovered this, that I did have grief over the loss of buddying around with two, quote, normal brothers, and latched on to others that were older than me and a lot. And it took that class for that to be revealed to me. It's, a lot of it was what you shared here. And I would encourage anyone that, it doesn't matter if it's chronic pain, the loss of a sibling, the loss of a parent, or being the caregiver of a sibling, where you both lost a parent, anything to take, to seek out that kind of a class, because like I said, it was life-changing for me. I had discovered that I was in the anger phase of my dad's death. My dad died at 46 and I was 23. And he died of a tumor that was curable and was wronged by a doctor. And we don't have to go down that road. But what that did was, looking back, when you really discover the stages of grief and all that, I was hung up in that anger phase for almost a decade and was so detrimental. And, I nearly lost my life personally because of it, on a number of occasions, because of the, of being stuck in that anger phase and not even knowing it, I guess. But the other interesting thing was, and I didn't know, my sister and I have recently launched a podcast for siblings that have developmentally disabled brothers or sisters. And our next episode that we're recording is on grief. And the funny thing is my sister was doing all the research, and as the individual with disability, there is nothing that we could find of any research on how for the individual with disabilities and how to approach grief, or there's no study that we could find that's
Right.
ever been done, and how to approach that. And our parents were really pioneers in Western New York for families that had special needs, and my sister and I now feel that pioneering urge that our parents had for siblings, because a lot of what you mentioned, Shruti, we've gone through, and I guess didn't even realize it.
Right.
Like you said,
Right.
not even realizing that
You don't.
you grieve. There are certain things
Right.
on grief and the lack of a relationship, or wanting the relationship to be different, and how we were kind of caregivers, and kind of, not that our parents purposely put us aside, but it happened, and it had to. We had
Yeah.
two children with disabilities in our family, and which was amazing in the sense that our parents made it as a couple, having two, and a lot of
That will
other
test a
issues.
marriage for sure.
Oh yeah. So
Right.
I really blowing the horn here on what you're doing, and reaching out to
Thank
this
you.
group, and it does kind of, although what my sister and I are doing obviously are focusing on grief and death, because it's so fresh for our brother John and Billy.
Right.
Billy kind of is at the level of a 3 to 4 year old, and is very well taken care of. So we have no idea what his understanding is of it, but can tell you this, that John is in the middle of a ongoing ritual where, uh, as with my father, has a very unique approach to grief, in the sense that it turns on and off like a switch at the same time every night.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that deserves to be looked at, and hopefully someday there'll be some official study of, especially in the autism spectrum, but, just in broad general, of intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, and how they grieve, or what their perception of it is. I mean, I asked my brother the other night, uh, I said, "Hey, John, Laura and I are doing our next show on grief. Do you know what that is?" And he said, "Helping other people." And he had no idea of the understanding of the word itself,
Yeah.
but yet he is grieving in a very powerful way. Um, so I just want to say thank you for, doing what you're doing, because as my sister and I kind of carry on what our parents did many, many years ago now, in a new kind of medium, doing podcasting, and just realizing there are some things like the Sibling Leadership Network, and the Tennessee Adult Brothers and Sisters, and a few other organizations, but not much, and definitely not enough. And
No, not at all.
so we're really excited to just share our life stories and experiences, and things like this are a big help to us, and just wanting to reach out to other sibs.
No, I appreciate that for sure, Larry. Thank you. And it's funny because I, being a grief therapist, I never thought about kind of zoning in to SIBS until I was at the conference in June. And from some conversations that I've had since that conference, I actually decided to start an online SIB grief support group,
Oh, wow.
which will be starting in October. And I have the flyer in front of me, but I don't think I can share flyers. But it's going to be offered online on Zoom, just like this, and it'll be at 3 different times per week. So I want to be cautious of everyone's time zones and make it so that people from around the world can attend as well. And I'm happy to send you that that flyer through email if you give me your email through the chat. I'm happy to do that
Yes,
as well. But I find that once we start talking about things, and it'll meet every other week, that there's a lot to say, and people need an outlet, because really nobody understands SIBs like other SIBs.
Right.
So
Right. Is there anyone else that like their feedback? And since we're about to record an episode on grief, we would love input as well from others on experiences that they had, maybe trying to understand how their sibling was grieving over a loss, or or some experience you've had, Shruti, um,
well,
and
yeah.
Jason.
So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Larry, but this is actually the first, and I mean, hopefully the first in a series of of webinars that I'm hoping to have. I'm working with another SIB who lives in California to come up with a bunch of different topics, and we're hoping to do one every month, just on different topics of being a SIB. And one of them will be explaining grief to your SIB and or your sibling, and trying to understand how they might be processing it. And
Yes.
those resources are ones that I'm working on the side as well, ever since the conference.
Well, this is great. I was happy to be a part of it. Great job, and
Thank you.
touching on a subject that that's not the easiest thing in the world to do, and not fun
Right.
for most.
Right. And there's no roadmap really, but I appreciate your input.
Yes. Awesome. Well,
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments or anything? All right. I think we can call it a night then.
awesome.
Thank you so much for being
Well,
here. And like I said, I'll post this on the Facebook group. And if anyone wants it directly emailed to them, please just put your email into the chat and I will send it to you.
yes, Shruti, I did. I posted my email and would
Wonderful.
love
Thank
to
you.
have a little ongoing conversation on the side. And
Perfect.
all right, wonderful. Thank you so much for having
Thanks so
this.
much. Thank you.
All right.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
All right.